David, on August 8th, Elon tweeted Tesla's going to unveil the robotaxi. In your opinion, how will the market react?
Look, Tesla stock's down, more than 50% this year. So the market's not putting a ton of stock in this yet. I think there's a wait-and-see attitude on this. There's the idea that when things start going south, Elon always has another way to keep the narrative going. Look, they clearly have technology, autopilot, and then FSD, but we'll see. It's hard to bet against them when it comes to technology because all of the Elon antics and drama aside, they have great technology in EVs. Their semi-autonomous stuff, the driver assist technology is pretty good. It's just the marketing and regulatory side of it's been a mess for them, but they have good stuff. So will they come out with this robotaxi in August? The market's certainly going to wait and see, and so would I, because we haven't seen them showing it off, and Elon's always late with everything. So if he does get there at all, where's the Roadster? So we'll see. I wish I had a firmer answer, but it's Elon.
It is Elon. Institutional investors, and Bloomberg's done a great job covering this. They want the Model 2. They clearly want the Model 2.
They want a growth story, and it's not clear that autonomy is for anybody. And that there's so many questions about autonomy, particularly on the passenger vehicle side of it. You look how slowly Waymo is deploying and growing this thing. And they've got to have the best technology out there. They certainly have the longest time of development and data gathering on this thing. And they're very deliberate in how they roll it out. And if they are, then Tesla's going to have to be. Investors want to see revenue growth, profitable revenue growth. You will get that with a Model 2. You will get that with good volumes on a Cybertruck, which we don't have right now. That's what they want out of Tesla. They want to see vehicle growth because they're realizing Tesla's a car company.
What if, this is a big what if. What if Tesla introduced two versions of the robotaxi, one with a steering wheel and pedals, one without, and it was that aha moment. You have the Model 2, but you also have the robotaxi at the same time.
Very possible. I don't know why they wouldn't. I mean, if they have this vehicle done, the reason they wouldn't is they realize the Model 2 is too expensive to sell at any kind of price, so they just turned it into a batch-built robotaxi. Now, that assumes a lot about their ability to build even robotaxi volumes and not have it be a complete money loser. But the Reuters story about the Model 2 being canceled or delayed is, I think there's something there, certainly, and we'll see what they come up with. I think investors do want the Model 2, though. That's been Elon's dream all along, and it also determines whether or not he can compete in all segments with BYD and the other Chinese EV makers. Without something like a Model 2 and in that price range, boy, it's pretty tough to compete with them because they're selling some really cheap EVs.
When did the BYD vehicles come to America by leveraging the NAFTA loophole?
I'm not sure Biden or Trump would allow that to happen. There are people in Congress now saying that they would. Josh Hawley, didn't he float the idea of a 100% tariff on Chinese vehicles made in Mexico? That's tough because there's a will in both parties to make sure that the U.S. auto industry and our European and Japanese and Korean friends don't get eaten up by the Chinese auto industry, particularly with electric vehicles. And I'll tell you what, and this is David just thinking aloud. When I started seeing all that's going on with TikTok and that we might mandate that they sell the company to be able to operate in the U.S., to me that's very interesting because in order for U.S. car companies to, really any foreign car company to do business in China originally, you had to have a 50-50 JV in which you gave your Chinese partner half the profits and access to your IP, right? So if this thing with TikTok is maybe a roadmap for how we're going to handle that, the Chinese do have a cost advantage and a battery advantage in some ways against Tesla, against certainly the established car makers. So if they want to do business here, do we force them into some sort of JV? I mean, it's just an idea because they did it to us, but what's going on with TikTok to me could be at least directionally where the U.S. government wants to go with Chinese bringing their technology into the U.S.
Let's throw some politics into the mix here. Speaker Johnson's going to bring the Ukraine bill and the Israel bill to the floor, and buried in there is banning TikTok. The Senate's going to be forced to take that bill up. There is some movement. If there is some movement from a legislative perspective on TikTok, does China retaliate in some way?
Look, that's the tightrope on which we walk. Yeah, I think they could. The opposite side of it is what I just said, though, is, the Chinese have made American companies join up with their companies, not just in the auto industry, but others as well, to do business over there. And we've let them buy whatever they wanted for the longest time in the U.S. and do whatever they wanted over here. And so now America has finally decided that the training wheels can come off for the Chinese companies, industries, and economy. And maybe we need to put it on ours in areas where they've used years of trade, let's call it trade deal largesse from us, and to degree the Europeans, to force some restrictions on Chinese companies. And, look at the European market, look at the South American market. market. Look at Mexico. You have a lot of EVs pouring in there. I've talked to some people at the Korean battery makers, and they worry about Chinese batteries being dumped here. They won't get the tax breaks, but they don't need it because their costs are so much lower because they've got established supply chains and minerals and all of that in China. So the Biden administration is clearly interested in protecting U.S. interests here, and I think Trump would as well. Like if Josh Hawley is sort of at this point a proxy for what Trump would do, and he's pretty MAGA. I mean, you know that side of the world better than I do in terms of the politics, but I think if Hawley's pushing that, then he probably has talked to Trump about it. But at a minute, that's where Trump would be. So neither president is going to allow this to happen.
What happens on the autonomy side? So China's obviously leading on electric vehicles because they control the supply chain. They're developing AI, they're developing chips, they're developing autonomous driving. What's going to happen when they try and export that to America? Does that raise another flag? It seems like China's trying to take over the entire automotive supply chain from a software perspective and a hardware perspective.
Yeah, I think with autonomy, we've got already pretty clear policies. I mean, look at what Too Simple just went through. It basically destroyed Too Simple, right? Plus their own kind of silliness behind the scenes in trying to deal with the CFIUS restrictions that they had. But, you know, they got CFIUS approval, and then they were investigated again, and then their founders and executives who left tried a new startup and taking some of the IP, and company is being sold for very small amounts of money, if it ever gets sold. And I think that's another blueprint for how we'll handle Chinese companies trying to bring their AI over here. Look, if you can't get TikTok here, you're not going to get an autonomous vehicle company gathering data in the U.S. That's mapping data. That's pretty sensitive. Not that they couldn't get that, but letting their cars drive around here, that's tough for me to see as well. I don't think we've ever seen anything like this where there's still a lot of trade going on between the U.S. and China. But then, you know, in other areas, particularly with technology, we're kind of in like active trade war on these things. So it's complicated, but I think at the end of the day, we're not going to let them take over the EV market in the US, and we're not going to let them have their way with autonomous technology and AI in the US.
When does autonomy and autonomous vehicles become a national security issue?
Probably when we make more headway in actually using them. I mean, look, the military is already using drones. They're already using self-driven vehicles to go into hot zones, that sort of thing. So the military, I think, is already, probably the NSA are paying a lot of close attention to autonomy. When does the federal government more publicly start to act on this stuff? I think it's when you start to, look, you and I have been waiting forever for the government to come up with a more standard set of rules for autonomous vehicles, and it's still kind of a state-by-state thing. And the government, I think, still sees autonomy is just this series of test fleets around the U.S., whether it be in trucking or robotaxis, and mostly in the Sunbelt states. So it's not really something that they see as they need to deal with in a pressing way, and that's just the way the government works. They always wait till technology becomes a problem before they start to deal with the issue.
But autonomy is becoming a business. I'm going to read a tweet here from Elon on X, if you call it X or tweet. I don't know what the term is now, but Elon tweeted the following on April 16th. Not quite betting the company, but going balls to the wall for autonomy is a blindingly obvious move. Everything else is like variations of a horse carriage. Then you have the co-CEO of Waymo out there saying LA is going to be a $2 billion market. Tesla signaling to the market, Waymo signaling to the market that this is a big business, but yet investors aren't paying attention, government's not really paying attention. Is this just a classic case of investors not understanding the sector and waiting to actually see meaningful results after being burnt from the SPAC craze, which we saw a lot of the autonomy companies go belly up?
Look, we've seen the whole thing winnowed down to, handful of players in, actually, you and I sort of predicted this. There are more players in the trucking freight sphere of autonomy. Robotaxi, what do you have left? There's May Mobility, Cruise, Waymo. May and Waymo are moving at a slow pace. Cruise has totally rebooted itself and is just getting back into, I wouldn't say service, but just getting back into running vehicles. And you have a handful of trucking guys doing some pretty interesting stuff. So what it kind of comes down to is we have a few operating systems in each sphere. The commercial freight area, moving people around town area. Look, Zoox is still there too. We just don't know where it is and what they're doing. So theoretically, 4 robotaxi-ish sorts of businesses out there. And then you have whatever Brian Selesky is starting up, but that's on the trucking side too. That's the former Argo guy. So yeah, look, it's come down to a handful of players and all really in some stage of experimentation. I mean, you do have like Gatik, they're bringing revenue in. Waymo is. But all, they're still kind of small operations that haven't been heavily scaled yet. They could be in the not too distant future. So we're finally at launch pad with some of these companies, but it's still not where we thought it was. Now could be a time for somebody to want to buy into some of these assets if any of them were available, and that's something I kind of watch for. just because you are starting to see some proof points that autonomy can become a business. If you look at it like M&A in the pharmaceutical sector, whenever you see a biotech company bought for $1 or $2 billion, that's because their drug is getting pretty close to approval, and the big pharma companies who buy them don't see this as big a risk. And I think with some of the autonomy companies, they're getting to the point where, okay, their technology works and there might be a business here, and somebody with some money might want to buy it or invest in it to try to get it to the next level and scale it up. I think we're getting closer to that point. I don't know exactly when it is, but I think you're starting to see some of that. It's still difficult to see it as an investment when you don't have federal regulations yet, and I know a lot of investors are on the sideline for that reason, but at least the technology is working pretty well, and you're starting to see some of these test fleets out there bringing some real money from paying customers.
They're bringing in real money, the test fleets. They're also generating money from defense. Defense is hot now. Andreessen Horowitz, Mark's out there, Ben's out there talking about American Dynamism and the investment that's going into DoD. Kodiak has a very large Department of Defense business. Forterra has a very large Department of Defense business. Does DoD become the old, new venture capitalists to accelerate the adoption of autonomy and the development of it?
The military, of all the things we've talked about, I'd put it on a scale here of where is autonomy most useful. And the military is absolutely number one, both for drones, which are already out there. I mean, they're being used left, right, and center in Russia, by Russia and against Russia and Ukraine, being used in Gaza. So that's an easy one. The U.S. military does use robots for bomb detection, but there are a lot of uses that I don't know about that they're probably already doing, and many more that they're working on. And look, that could help a lot of these companies get funding to continue to work on commercial and consumer type of applications. The military is a great place for this stuff too. Plus they have a big budget. And one thing I do know about the military is I had a close friend who used to work for a civilian engineer for the Army. They have all kinds of programs they spend a lot of money on, and some of them never see the light of day, but they do some pretty active R&D. And being able to accomplish missions while keeping troops out of harm's way is huge for them. After that, look, it's trucking, because there's a real need there. And I do think it's easier to do. Highway trips between distribution centers and hub and spoke kind of systems, really good application. Robotaxi is the toughest because it requires the most data, and even if you're safer, even if you have very few accidents and no fatalities like Cruise did, there's still a lot of scrutiny when something happens.
Does Uber become the biggest winner for the robotaxi because they act as a Visa and a MasterCard for autonomy? They get a cut of that transaction for each ride without having to take the legal liability, without having to build the infrastructure, without having to spend the billions of dollars. Is that who they become?
I'm not sure how they avoid the liability, because they'd be the operator of the vehicle, even if it's somebody else's car. It's sort of like if you and I get in an accident, a lawyer would sue us and the company just because they blanket it first and see who can escape the litigation. But look, Uber could be a big winner here if somebody can make this work, because they've been trying to get rid of the driver cost for a long time.
Then it's very interesting to say, because RBC Capital Markets put out a report that's available in the terminal, where RBC Capital Markets has been feeling a massive increase in calls about the impact on Uber's business, leading to investors increasingly shorting Uber. Uber currently has a 2.61% short interest. Is this investors, in your opinion, trying to get ahead of potential trend, or is this simply investors not having a deep understanding of how the market works for autonomy?
Good question. Is it a sign that there's still no faith in autonomy delivering anytime soon?
Could be.
The public companies that are out there in autonomy, are they worth shorting? Because all the stocks are really depressed as it is. There aren't many of them. But if you really believed in autonomy and you had a long-term investment horizon, you'd see more people going long in it right now. I always kind of use Aurora as the benchmark. And where are they trading right now? I mean, that's been a depressed stock for quite a while. They're still trading at 276, down 10% this year almost. It's just sort of been lingering down there waiting for proof points. Because they've switched to trucking, although they do have some robotaxi technology too, they're probably the best proxy for market sentiment on autonomous vehicles.
Okay, let's stay on the Aurora truck for a minute. Aurora is very public, and they did an investor day that they're going to go drive her out in Q4. Commercial, not testing, not doing what Too Simple did, the Ghost Rider, one night, two night, running multiple revenue generating runs. Does that start to move the investor sentiment if those runs are successful over the course of a quarter, 2 quarters, 3 quarters, that this technology is real and it's working?
Yeah, I think it would. That's kind of what they've predicated their business plan on, is getting that technology working, test driver free. Their plan, I think, is prove that out, and that'll help them raise more money. And then if they get enough, then they can start to scale it up. Does it make the stock skyrocket? Tough to say, just because it's such a depressed segment. But it certainly will have investors watching, put it that way. Whether or not they buy, yeah, who knows? Investors are pretty fickle, and there are a lot of good technology plays going on. I think the money, those who want to try to bet and bet big, will go into other kinds of AI that'll have a more near-term approach. And really, what have we seen right now? It's been the picks and shovel side of AI, that's NVIDIA, that's been drawing a lot of the money. And there's still a wait and see, but I look, that will get people looking. That'll get people watching it at a minimum.
Get people watching. And you look at the picks and shovel side of AI, I'm fascinated with what Andy Jassy is doing at Amazon. The Anthropic investment was brilliant. They put it into the Amazon AWS Bedrock system. Obviously, they have Zoox, and we don't know what's going on at Zoox. I've heard that they tried to put it on trucks and it didn't work. I've also heard the system is highly dependent on Hesai LiDARs, and if there was a Hesai ban, the Zoox vehicle wouldn't work. But that aside, could we see Amazon get really clever and do a prime mobility tier to start to generate some of this revenue? So Vegas is a city, perhaps San Francisco is another city, just do it strategic cities to try and generate some of this revenue, not do a pay per ride, but a monthly subscription service.
I mean, like roll out their own new division, incorporating their different autonomy bets and trying to make some money off of this? Jeez. It's a good idea. I just don't know if that's where their head is. They've been very secretive about this whole thing. I mean, you and I have been trying to figure out where they are for a long time. I'd have to say pass on that one. I don't know what they're going to do.
To me, Amazon, if you look at, and Jassy is out there very publicly, cut cost. He said that in his annual shareholder letter. Increase warehouse efficiency, increase automation. To me, the big play for Amazon is trucking, autonomous trucking. They have the program there. Do they just kind of leave Zoox to make it Bezos' little pet project and then really just double and triple down on autonomous trucking? Because that fits into their core business operations?
I've wondered. I see a lot of people delivering Amazon packages that aren't in the big vans, right? It's individuals. Do you replace them for your small targeted deliveries with a fleet of robotaxi type of cars that Zoox would do? Does that make sense? That could. Now, the problem with package delivery autonomously has always been people aren't necessarily home. So how do you drop the package off, get it to the front door? So do you have some sort of Zoox-style vehicle where you're not paying someone who's a driver, you just have a sorter type of person in there, and the vehicle knows where to go, the vehicle does all the scheduling, and could that somehow increase their throughput? That's a possibility. It's always, to me, been kind of a head-scratcher that Amazon bought Zoox, because Zoox wasn't a trucking autonomous company. Amazon does a lot of things, right? They've got content in addition to all the goods they sell. They've got content, they've got Amazon Web Services, a lot of things that they do. I've wondered if Zoox wouldn't be something like Amazon Web Services, where it becomes an autonomous operating system for car companies who don't want to develop this, which is basically all of them except for General Motors and Toyota, because Toyota's got the investment in May Mobility. Everybody else, to the degree that they're interested in autonomy, needs or would want that. Is that their play with Zoox? Well, I can see that. I mean, look, we thought forever, or some people did, it was highly debated, was Apple going to come up with a car? And yes, they were developing a car. Yes, they hired people who understand suspensions and chassis and driving dynamics and that sort of thing. As it turns out, if you look at CarPlay 2, CarPlay 2 actually gets into the vehicle. It's not just a projection system for infotainment. That's probably what they were doing all along. So maybe built a vehicle, and they might have had an idea of building their own vehicle at one point, but what they probably were really doing is developing vehicles, and an autonomous system, by the way, because they were testing those. If you look at the disengagement reports, the vehicle was just literally a test vehicle for them to try out autonomy, to try out how they could have a more integrated software-based vehicle system that they could sell in the same way that Google is working with GM on their software-based system, and so on and so forth. A lot of this is being a supplier for the software and brains of a vehicle behind the scenes. And if you're Apple, you have to do that by owning a vehicle or building your own vehicle and developing the software for it. And then you would sell that as an operating system that's more than just a CarPlay sort of play. Does Amazon do that? I can see that.
If Amazon licensed Zoox, they can bundle with AWS. That gets really interesting. So you get a whole complete package there. I just don't know if licensing fits in Amazon's core business. It always seems that they're historically an operations business. I'm not sure if I see licensing. I do see licensing as being a huge, huge business. When I look at licensing, I think a lot about, I believe at some point Tesla will crack FSD. They're going to figure out self-driving. At some point they probably will. They will license it.
Our friend Alan Osman disagrees with this, because this came up at Arts 23, and it was the final question, and Alan said, Elon talked about full self-driving in 2016, he's full of it. I'm paraphrasing, sorry Alan. And I said, look, you're right, but he also has Elon/Tesla. They have the ability to lure and pay some of the smartest people out there for this sort of thing. And I do think Tesla's serious about it. But they've been in hot water with regulators over autopilot, so they've got to get this right. And Elon does miss targets all the time. But I think they're totally serious about this, and I think they probably got some very good capabilities, too. So when it comes to transportation technology, you just can't count Tesla out, no matter how annoyed you may be with Elon Musk and impatient with his previous announcements.
When they crack FSD, they license it. Does that become their biggest business inside of Tesla, licensing?
Certainly could, right? I mean, in the same way that it could for Waymo and that it could for Cruise if they ever get their act together, and it could be for Amazon, could be for May Mobility for that matter. Any of these companies could do that. Think about, Grayson, think about all the trucking companies you and I talk about all the time. They don't want to build trucks. They want to sell their system to truck partners. And is that a licensing agreement? I mean, there are different ways you can legally set it up, and that gets beyond my knowledge of this stuff, but that's what they're going to do. GM had licensed OnStar years ago to Lexus and might have been Mercedes, and they had a couple partners. It never really lasted. They didn't do a good job of spreading that around, but there is a model where even if you're a car company, you develop this system that works pretty well and you license it to competitors. They might have to spin it out to do that. The other companies we're talking about don't have that problem because they're not car companies. May Mobility may be funded by Toyota, but it's nothing that says they couldn't send their system out to somebody else. And same thing with Amazon and /Zoox. And I think that is Waymo's business besides running their own robotaxi business.
I'll give you a prediction on May Mobility. They're going to be acquired by a Japanese conglomerate. I'm not saying Toyota, but I believe they're going to be acquired by a Japanese corporation conglomerate, and they'll become a Japanese company based on the new rule that went into effect April 1st around the overtime, the massive driver shortage in Japan, the age in population, and they have the ability in the Toyota relationship to go into that market, and May Mobility becomes the largest self-driving car company in Japan when they get acquired. That's what I think what happens to May.
That's a pretty fearless forecast, but look, there's a lot of logic there. I would think Toyota would be the one to do it. And you end up with a model sort of like when GM bought Cruise in the first place, where they provide the vehicles and a lot of the integration engineering, and Toyota's got massive market share in Japan. So what easier way to kind of control that business as a leader in Japan because you're getting instant volume. I don't think Toyota would let somebody else take it out from under them. And it wouldn't cost them much. Toyota's got a lot of cash. It wouldn't cost them much to buy this, I don't think.
No, it would cost much to buy. I don't think it would cost much to move it. I think the tech is fit for that market the way that May's rolled out. You covered this early on when they ran the Detroit Circulator. They've done a lot of really interesting things. I just think their model fits for where the Japanese government wants to go with autonomy. Let's get back to Tesla. So Tesla cracked self-driving. Does that cause a complete reboot of the autonomous driving stack where Tesla's able to do it with a camera-based perception system? Does Waymo force to develop it's called a Waymo Light system? And does that open the door for Wave, the UK startup, to gain significant market share since they're using an embodied AI approach very similar to what Tesla's doing? Does that become the new approach?
Well, back up. Tesla does use LiDAR, though.
No LiDAR.
They don't have any. I thought they had incorporated some into their vehicles. Anyway, I don't know that the technology you use to be the many eyes of the vehicle matters. I think whatever system works, everyone's going to have to use. And when we'll see in August, maybe Tesla incorporates LiDAR into a system that's supposed to be full robotaxi. They haven't said anything about that, but I think it's possible.
Or a 4D radar would be interesting if they incorporate a 4D radar, which has some similar capabilities as a LiDAR. The stack's going to be the big question. Nobody's talking about that. What's the stack going to look like? Is it going to be the same thing you buy in a Model 3 or Model Y today? Or did Tesla build a bespoke stack just for the robotaxi? That's the big question that should be asked. What does the stack look like?
I think they'd have to build a bespoke stack for the robotaxi, because the mapping requirements and data requirements are a lot bigger. If you're going to go robotaxi,
they are. And then don't forget, you have to have a steering wheel and pedals, otherwise you need a NHTSA exemption. You think Elon's going to get a NHTSA exemption in this political environment?
If the car works, I think he would, but Cruise was working on theirs until everything blew up on them. So I think NHTSA is going to eye that stuff very cautiously, given the environment that autonomy is certainly under right now.
Let's get on Cruise. You broke the story with Cruise testing in Phoenix. They made some key hires. They hired Steve Kenner as Chief Safety Officer. They hired a good friend of mine, Rob Grant, as he's now the Chief Government Affairs Officer. You're hiring Mr. Kenner, you're hiring Mr. Grant.
They pulled a Billy Martin with Rob Grant.
Yes, they did. A fun thing about Rob, and Rob, I'm going to say, Rob, his childhood dream, and you'll appreciate this, David, was to play the outfield for the New York Yankees. That was Rob's childhood dream.
That's great. I didn't even know he was a Yankees fan.
He is. I said to him on his first run through, before he pull the Billy Martin maneuver. Rob, the greatest thing ever, and you would have to join us, David. We're in New York. We get picked up in Midtown at the Bloomberg building on Lex, and we go to a Yankees game in a Cruise self-driving car. Now, that would be something else.
That would. Although, look, I think it'll be a long time before we see robotaxis in New York because, first off, it's obviously really difficult to drive in Manhattan. But remember, Cruise wanted to test AVs years ago in New York. And the city or the state are both mandated that you had to have a state trooper following the vehicle and pay the officer overtime to do it, and it was so onerous, Cruise scrapped the plan. So I think in New York, you're looking at a similar, maybe even more rigorous regulatory environment than you see in San Francisco, and that's tough. And look, one thing we haven't mentioned is what if Waymo in California has to have safety drivers now because of the legislation going on there? You've got more detail on that than I do, but the regulatory environment in these really congested cities where we actually need robotaxis more, and where they make a lot of sense, is getting tougher.
It looks like the driver in bill's dead. Doesn't look that it's going to get through. The one that Waymo's fighting very hard that will destroy their business overnight is the local control bill. Local control bill continues to move along. It's not great, but it continues to move along. It doesn't say momentum it did, which will essentially would allow each city municipality to set their own rules. If that became law, Waymo's out of business in California. It's over. Every AV company's done in California. It's an effective ban. That's the big one.
Why is it a ban, though, if every municipality can set their own rules? Because San Francisco would probably be tough on robotaxis, but other towns, especially smaller towns with wider streets, might let them in.
Let's use the LA example. Let's say, we're going to stay on sports here. We're downtown watching a Lakers game. It's an afternoon game, and then we want to go to the beach, to take a swim, and have some dinner. So you have to go through LA, you go through West Hollywood, you go through Beverly Hills, you go through Santa Monica, and you end up in Malibu. That's 5 separate municipalities with 5 different sets of laws. So what's the next thing? They're going to put their own DMV to enforce those rules? It gets tricky. It gets absolutely tricky.
Yeah, it does, actually. Waymo could still do trips in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, getting people from homes or business and parking to sports arenas and that sort of thing. But yeah, you're right. You couldn't take your robotaxi from the Lakers game to Malibu Beach. It puts a lot of restrictions on their businesses. There's just such a significant voice in California that doesn't like robotaxi that I don't know if it destroys everybody's business, but it reduces the appeal to do business there. The cost to deal with the regulatory scheme in San Francisco and in California has got to be pretty high. The amount of staffing you have, the amount of work you need to do, paying attorneys to go to hearings, all these sort of things. It just makes their life difficult. And it's a tough place to drive, so I'm not saying they shouldn't necessarily do that. Waymo started out in Chandler, Arizona, this suburb of Phoenix. I've been actually in Chandler. I lived there for a week when I was playing in the Old Man's World Series. It's an easy place to drive. You're talking 5-6 lane roads and, protected turns going into shopping malls and strip malls and this sort of thing. That's very good basic driving for a robotaxi.
Waymo learned there. Cruise should have started in an environment similar than not in San Francisco, the hostile environment. We'd be having a different conversation today about Cruise.
Yeah. I think Cruise would say that too. That they kept saying, if they kept referring to this as a moonshot. And I think it was a moonshot because they picked one of the most difficult cities to drive in and gathered map data on. You're talking 5-point intersections and things like that. Big hills and congestion and pedestrians everywhere. Really tough. Look where Oliver Cameron, who ended up at Cruise, he started with Voyage. They were in retirement centers. Very easy driving. And really, if you think about what Gaddick does for Walmart, really easy driving. And you build and the machine learns and you get better and you can make some revenue in the meantime. Yeah. And so where's GM restarting? Phoenix. And they were looking at Houston, which is another southwestern city with hospitable weather and wide, I used to live in Texas, very wide open streets, newly paved streets, better signals. Northeastern cities, the infrastructure is older and roads are narrower, things are tougher to read. Just easier to drive in those areas.
The Cruise is costing GM a lot of money. It's impacting their operating income by $3.5 billion in 2023. $3.2 billion in 2022 and $1.3 billion in 2021. How's GM going to rein in the costs?
Well, they already have. We'll see. So they announce earnings this coming Tuesday, and I'll be keenly watching how much they spend on Cruise in the first quarter, because they laid off a quarter of the workforce. They've downed their tools they were gathering data, which means they had people in cars on the ground in 20 markets. Now they're doing it in 1. They were operating in 3 with a large fleet in San Francisco. All of that is shut down. So you take away all that headcount, you take away all those operations in those other cities, vehicles running, charging, real estate, all those expenses thrown in, licensing, you name it, And I mean, is it half? I don't know, but it's going to be a lot less. And we'll see. But I think we've already seen how they're going to rein in costs. I don't know that they do any more than that, because now that they've started testing in a market, maybe they'll add one or two others if things go well, that tells you that they probably bottomed out in terms of the whole grounding and freeze of the business. And now they're starting to slowly work their way back up the curve.
They're starting to slowly work their way up the curve, and then CFRA is out there in a research report saying there's an alphabet moonshot that's going to contribute materially to the bottom line by 2027. They're predicting that to be Waymo. That's 3 years from now. Let's say Waymo goes public, Alphabet goes public with the Waymo numbers, they're significant. Does that put pressure on GM to once again ramp up operations? Or are they just going to take this slow and steady and they're not going to move as fast as they did last time, no matter what the market's doing?
There's going to be pressure on GM, but I really think they were burned so hard by this that they are absolutely going to go very slowly with it. And with my book on Mary Barra, it's called Charging Ahead for a reason. But if you look at her technology bets, Mary Barra has been a very, very aggressive CEO. They're not selling a lot of EVs right now because they stopped building the Bolt and they're going to come out with a new one next year. But look at, starting with the Hummer and the Cadillac Lyriq, now you've got a Blazer, Equinox, a Chevy Silverado EV. You actually have two different Hummers. You have a GMC coming later this year. You have the two Bright Drop electric vans out there. That's like 8 or 9 EVs they're launching in 2 years. That's a very aggressive launch schedule. They were very aggressive with Cruise. They are replacing CarPlay with their own Ultify system. Again, an aggressive move. And in all three of those areas, they've had technological difficulties getting this stuff to work and getting it out the door. They're fixing some of that stuff, but it's a really aggressive company when it comes to trying to get this stuff out there and take a leadership position. And I mean, you got to give them an A for effort and then maybe a D- for execution. And they're working to fix these things. Between the battery fires with the Bolt and the meltdown at Cruise, and now they're slowly working their way out of production issues they've had with the Ultium battery pack. They're finally getting some decent volume, still not great volume of production with those batteries. I think they can't afford another problem. So even though they may feel pressure to want to go into more cities and speed up testing and start to monetize and show their shareholders that there's a reason they're paying whatever they're going to be paying every quarter for it, downside risk to going too fast is way too big for this company. It's one of the single biggest problems that GM has, is when they announced they were replacing CarPlay, everybody was skeptical that their own system would be any good because their technology bets have not always gone so well. And they have to overcome that. And you don't do that by rushing back to market with autonomy and having another problem. It's just, I think that's the reality they face.
They do. Why has GM been so bad at executing these new technological advancements?
Look, I think they tried to move really fast and it hurt them. All of the legacy car companies have had serious problems launching electric vehicles. Porsche, VW have had software problems, pretty serious software problems, I think. Toyota had wheels falling off the BZ4X, which is crazy, literally wheels falling off of it because they used the same bolts that they used for the wheels on their internal combustion vehicles, but there was extra weight and torque and they got loose. Look, Toyota's a great manufacturer. When they're having problems, you know this is a tough assignment. GM's problems, I've written a ton about, you and I've talked a lot about them, but everyone's having difficulty. They're all going through the problems that Tesla went through 5-10 years ago. And so I think that's GM and the other car companies. They thought, we make cars, this is just a different powertrain, so it'll be fine. Well, it wasn't. Why are they having trouble with that software system in the Chevy Blazer? They're not a software company. They've added a lot of people from Silicon Valley, and they've hired a lot of code writers, and they're building that organization, but software's tough. And if you have software problems in a vehicle, it's not something that can happen. If your iPhone crashes on you, you reboot it, and okay, you go on about your day. It's annoying, and it can happen at very opportune times. I once missed a really good fantasy trade because my iPhone crapped out on me. That's not a safety issue, right? And it's not the vehicle you drive every day. I think in a lot of these cases, and Cruise very well documented that they moved too fast with it, I think they just wanted to catch up to Waymo. They wanted to catch up to Tesla. They wanted to try to get out from under the yoke of Apple CarPlay in their car, and they tried to do all these things, and there are times when speed kills, and I think in all three cases it did.
Move fast and break things doesn't work in the automotive business, point blank.
Honestly, I don't know that it works that great in the technology business either. It's just easier to get away with because it's easier to iterate and easier to update than it is to fix vehicles, and it's less embarrassing and people don't get injured when a phone crashes or a software or a video game package has bugs in it on version 1.0.
What should we watch for in the autonomous vehicle and truck industries as these companies begin to commercialize?
On the truck side, we're going to see a lot of launches this year. So I think second half of this year is going to be really big to see how well this technology works. Because if it does work well, we're seeing a lot of stuff from, you talked about Aurora earlier, we know Gatik is doing some stuff later this year and continues to do, and they're doing some things right now. If this technology continues to work well, we could see autonomous trucking maybe shift into second gear in 2025. Robotaxi, Waymo is still the one to watch. So if they can start to accelerate their scaling and their deployment, that tells you that technology is getting closer to ready for prime time. And by prime time, I mean like really pushing bigger fleets, more cities quickly. Look, we got to watch Cruise too, just because when do they go from, well, I mean, right now what they're doing is testing with a driver, but really they're just regathering mapping data and refreshing what they've already gathered in Phoenix, and they're probably doing some other cities eventually. At what point do they start actually providing service, even if there's a test driver in the vehicle? And that's how they've mapped this out. They said once they're satisfied that they've remapped it accurately, then they'll start pushing it into the next level, which is just ferrying people around with a test driver in the car. It's going to be a long time for them. If that next phase of carrying people around still has a test driver in it, they're a long ways from where they were 7 months ago when you could go to San Francisco and get a ride with no driver.
Cruise has a long road ahead of them. They're making the right decisions. They're making the right hires, and we'll see how far along they get on that road. David, for today, as we look to wrap up, what would you like our listeners and viewers to take away with them?
Keep an eye on the things that you and I just talked about. This year is huge for electric vehicles, too. Tesla's sales were not only down sequentially, they were down year over year, which is big. In the U.S., that is. So where are U.S. consumers with electric vehicles? Yeah, there is a big pause, but you're also seeing some important vehicles come to market right now that are lower priced. And I think we need to keep an eye on that to see how ready the American consumer is to try out new technology and go with an EV. So I'd keep an eye on that as well.
Watch the autonomy markets. Watch the EV markets. We're going into second gear on autonomy. EV market, we're going to see how consumers adapt. The future is bright. The future is autonomous. The future is commercialization.